you started with a great line in this book. It's the question, you say, that never ever disappoints in a conversation. What was the first album that changed your life? Records that gave you hope when you felt lost, that directed them when life seemed as if it was anchorless, or just gave them strength to give your parents the middle finger? As you eloquently put it, it was either that or what was the first album that cracked open your skull and made you feel things? So, with that in mind, I have to ask you, what was yours?
See, that's an interesting question because there are a couple different ones. I mean, the first one that really mattered to me was Billy Joel, The Stranger. That was, for some reason, that record, it was the first record I bought that my parents didn't know about, and there was something about the album cover that looked arty and weird. I mean, Billy Joel's, wearing a suit with no shoes, and there's this weird art on the wall, and he's got boxing gloves. So it seemed mysterious and dangerous to me. But the one after that, which was much more significant, was the Replacements' Let It Be album. That's when all of a sudden I found this record, and it was like, I had nothing in common with anything in these any of these songs. Nothing spoke to my experience. I wasn't an androgynous punk rocker. I wasn't, an alcoholic who would go to a bar every night. At 16, there wasn't a lot to hang on to, but it felt dangerous, and it felt like I knew something that nobody else in my school did. I had a secret. All these fools were like listening to Genesis or YouTube, but I had this thing where I tell people like, I'm in the Replacements, and they're like, what the hell are you talking about? What is replace? I don't even know what that is. So I really felt like it helped me forge an identity. Like there was something, I would sit in my bedroom and listen to these songs and screaming, I'm not satisfied. And it's like, yes, that is it. And it was also the Replacements album is where I hid my weed as a teenager. That was my secret hiding spot. I thought my parents would never think to look at a Replacements album, and they never did because it's just silly.
There is always this temptation, which you allude to as well in the book, especially when you are trying to look cool, to pick something that's perceived to be cool, as opposed to what you might think people see as embarrassing.
Exactly. And to me, that was the most fascinating stories when the people, some of the rock stars I talked to would talk about records that weren't cool, like Ian MacKaye, the lead singer of Minor Threat and Fugazi. He's a punk icon. He almost single-handedly, him and Henry Rollins really started this punk movement. And his record, the one that meant so much to him, was the Woodstock double album or triple album.
Oh yes,
they would listen to Woodstock and go like, oh, that's what I want to do with my life. I want to organize rock festivals and, get all these bands out in some open, muddy field.
There is great credit due, though, to many of these people that appear in your book for actually being honest and open. You open with a great dialogue from Nirvana interview with Dave Grohl calling all records shit. CDs were all the rage back then, of course, but his first album was a K-Tel collection called Blockbuster. Now, I actually went to see whether I could find that, and there is still, if you look on Amazon, you can actually find it. But K-Tel were the big thing then. It was 20 greats of the time. All the songs on those, by the way, used to be edited down. Because you got me going on this, because the other thing with this book is it sends you off meandering, looking for useless information. So I ended up looking at the career of K-Tel. And they did. They cut all the records down, the singles, to fit under 3 minutes as you could get them on. And the reason they could sell them so cheaply was because they used to put them on very thin acetate.
Wow. Really? I had no idea about that.
Well, there's another book for you. The History of K-Tel.
My gosh. I see. I had some K-Tel too growing up. I used to love those records because if there was just one song on there you liked, that was usually enough. And then you would discover all these other artists because of it. I mean, I was really, when I was younger, the TV show Greatest American Hero. I love that theme song, the "Believe It or Not, I'm Walking on Air." And I was like, I need that song, and it was on a K-Tel collection, which I still have somewhere. And then it just all of a sudden I'd listen to that song over and over again, and then it would, you would all of a sudden be listening to all these other crazy songs, and like that had nothing to do, weren't even in the same kind of sphere. Oh, what was it? It was Night Flight, K-Tel's Night Flight collection. I'm trying to find it right now.
Do you know what? People reading this book are going to be coming out. And when I mean coming out, they're going to be coming out and admitting what was their first record that had an effect. Because after you find out what Kurt Cobain's was, there will be never any need to feel as if you were embarrassed. And you said, I was thinking maybe it's Sabbath, a bit of Zeppelin. Terry Jack's Seasons in the Sun was never off the bloody radio over here.
I mean, everything about we had joy, we had fun, we had seasons in the sun. I mean, not the kind of hard rocking you'd expect.
He only had one hit,
Nirvana,
didn't he? And that was it. Terry Jacks.
You're right.
What was actually deemed rubbish as well back then is often now viewed to be the height of classic. I happen to be doing a piece on something to do with Queen, and I was reading a review from Rolling Stone about Jazz, the album, which was called everything from dull, pastiche, elitist, absurdly dull, filled with dumb ideas. 30 years later, Rolling Stone have included it on their albums, which we panned, which are now called classics.
Hindsight's always 20/20. We look back on these things with different lenses.
Suzi Quatro, the object of desire for many a boy growing up in the 70s, including me. I did have the big poster with that leather catsuit on with the zip that was halfway down.
Oh, sweet mama. It's burned into my subconscious.
Well, all I can say is I was shocked to read at the age of 14, she ended up in a hotel room with the bass player of the Blues Magoos smoking weed for the first time.
At 14! That is so young!
I couldn't believe it. And she had very strict parents as well, didn't she? From what I can gather.
Did. But she also sounded like she had her head on straight. Like she was 14 and doing weed with bass players, which is a recipe for disaster for any teenage girl or boy. That's just a bad idea. But, that she wasn't she didn't allow herself to be seduced or lured into a situation that she was uncomfortable with. She was just there for the music to open up, to expand her musical horizons. So she is a tough and badass. And I would think even at 14, I'd be like, I'm not going to mess with her because she will kick my ass.
If I'm lucky. You spoke to about 35 artists, differing backgrounds. How did you draw up the list of who you wanted to speak to?
That was an interesting process because I wanted to get as wide a range as possible, both in terms of ages, gender, influences. Because if it was just up to who I liked, it would be a lot of middle-aged white guys who were into Midwestern punk, which would grow tiresome, and I don't know how much you really learn from something like that. So I was trying to look for people who I knew, but also older people like Don McLean and Tommy Rowe, who's like 78, and then look for younger artists like Mitski or Mia Baron, who I hadn't even heard about until recently, who's in this band called Pom Pom Squad, which is amazing. If you get a chance to check it out, she's got kind of a Sleater Kinney thing going on, and she just turned 21. So she is of an era in which teenagers grew up with the prospect of, you can steal all your music online if you really know what you're doing. For a lot of us who came of age with record stores and and you had to go out hunting. And there's a very different type of hunting for music in an era of Spotify and digital everything and YouTube, where you can just, wander down these beautiful rabbit holes. But to see how much diversity I could bring to this, to see how many different, like Donny Osmond, not a fan of Donny Osmond, but he was fascinating to talk to about how he discovered music. And Wayne Kramer of the MC5. So to try to get as many different generations as I could, and as many different life experiences. So it's really not about I want to read this conversation, this interview, because I love this artist, but just the way that people talk about their experiences discovering music. It almost tells you about like the time period too. Like Verdon White, the bass player in Earth, Wind & Fire, his experience with discovering music was very specific to the South Side of Chicago and the culture there, and the way kids would bring music outside of schools to play for each other. And his brothers were all performing at this nearby studio and playing with Muddy Waters and all these amazing artists, and they bring home these 45s that they played on. And that was the family's entire music collection, was stacks of 45s that they brought directly from the studio that weren't going to be out in the radio for weeks. So Verdon was telling me these stories about the women in the big fur coats during a Chicago winter, and going to shows, and his brother coming home with this crate, and they had one record player in the living room that everyone had to share, and this thing that no one of a certain age or under a certain age would remember, that when you're putting down the record, there were some record players where you had to balance it by, you got to put a nickel on top of it to make sure it doesn't skip. And there was this one nickel, Verdon told me, that was perfect. It was the one that held it down perfectly. And if you lost the nickel, you were in trouble with Dad. So you had to make sure the nickel. And he got so excited. This memory came back to him about the specific nickel. And always remember, like, you pick up the needle. Gotta be careful. You don't want to drop that nickel, because if it drops off and scratches that record belongs to everyone in the family. You are screwed, man. You are up in your room and you are grounded for the rest of the month. So I love the way they paint those experiences.
Cherie Currie summed it up well for me as well, because she said, there's no social media, there's no mobile phones. It was magazines, radio and TV shows. In the US, you had the Midnight Special, I think it was. We had Top of the Pops, which wasn't particularly good, or the Old Grey Whistle Test, which was. And if you missed it, you would sort of end up in a depression. But she describes as well waiting in car parks. Who didn't do this? At the record store, when there was a special release and the record store would open, it would open at maybe at midnight, and you're waiting. I think she was waiting for David Bowie live. But get that moment that you get your hands on the album, you get it home, and you're in your room, and you're careful not to turn it up too loud, just in case the parents hear. It just describes a scene which is completely, I was talking to my daughter about it, it's completely alien to them. They have absolutely no idea what on earth you're talking about.
Having to sneak in records like they're contraband. And just the excitement building up to this, like there was none of that instant gratification. I mean, like you were saying with Cherie, having to wait outside the record store, and even to try to find some of these records. I mean, to figure out what you wanted to listen to, there was much more investigative work. There was much more, talking to people, and the influence of older brothers or older siblings was kind of amazing to me. How much of the musical tastes that people developed was due to what their brothers or the friends of brothers had stored in their closet, and you would go through these things like your
Perry Farrell
treasure.
Perry Farrell, you interviewed for that, and I think that sums up perfectly. Here's where his musical tastes came from.
Yes, very much from his siblings, and wanting to be a part of those parties they'd have in the basement, and he'd talk his way into being the DJ, and he would dance for them, and that's why they'd allow him to stay and hang out, which is just, you think of Perry today, he's like this, indie icon and Lollapalooza and Jane's Addiction, but back then just this gawky little kid who wanted to impress his his older siblings, like, oh, can I play some records and for your makeout parties in the basement?
Do you know that, though?
So sweet.
When you talk about cool here, it is unlikely, as you wend your way through the book, that you would find anybody quite as cool as Chris Stein of Blondie, despite the fact that this guy was into various movie soundtracks or whatever. He revels in telling you of the first album of influence was Alvin and the Chipmunks' Christmas album.
I just love that so much. And no hesitation. It's not like he's like, this is kind of an embarrassing thing. Like, no, it was Alvin and the Chipmunks.
Is that because, though, if you started out uncool, you then became part of Blondie, you became uber cool. Now you've grown into that as sort of elder statesman. You're now, a measurement above what is uber. So regardless of however embarrassing anything looks, as far as you're concerned, you can turn it cool.
That could be. I mean, that's part of the reason that I wanted to write this book, going back to that Nirvana story you're talking about with Dave Grohl, was that an early interview with Nirvana, Kurt Cobain had talked about his first record was, as we were talking about, Seasons in the Sun. And it was just a throwaway line. It was just something, and then the band teased him about it. And he'd written in a journal that was the record that made him cry. So that was consumed me. Like, there is a story there. There's got to be a fascinating explanation for his relationship with that record and how that shaped him. So, I mean, I guess part of it is that when you become a cool, rock star, rock legend, Chris Stein and Blondie, that it's okay, but something about Alvin and the Chipmunks hit him at the right time and influenced him in some way, and it mattered. It truly mattered. I mean, the songs that embarrass us, that matter, and the songs that were inadvertently cool, that they all mix together in this goulash of that make up who we are. So that's you learn so much from somebody asking them about that first record or records and how they justify what they were listening to or how they found it or what it did to their brain. I mean, I can only imagine Chris Stein listening to Alvin and the Chipmunks going, yeah, this is it. This is the stuff.
Do you know there's a dreadfully English moment with Jeff Downes, and I can just I imagine this. Parents couldn't understand in this dreadfully English way that one would do things. Why on earth he would want to buy a record? Because it's free on the radio. Why would you want to buy it? It's just so English.
It is. You could just go find it. Why would you waste time? But there's something about the ownership. I mean, I have that right now too with digital music. That I love my iPod. I love listening to Spotify. I discover so much that way. But it's owning that physical record.
Oh, you have to own it. You've got to own it.
You really do.
Yeah, absolutely.
I really think there's something in those grooves that capture moments. That's why for my other book, Rock Stars on the Record, that's why I needed to find my old records, because these are testaments to our experiences. It becomes more than just the sound. It's these objects are important. Like if my house caught fire, I know like there's 6 or 7 records I'd get, and then I'd find my wife and son.
But it's true. I was going to ask you about this because we've been talking about Rock Stars on the Record, which is a great book, really entertaining book. And the great thing about this book is the fact that you can do volume 2, 3, 4, 5. So, I mean, it can go on for as long as people want to actually answer the question that you were to ask them. But the other book, Old Records Never Die, which is a couple of years ago, is you setting out to search for the records that you lost or mislaid or left somewhere back in your teenage years. Now, how many of those did you actually get hold of again?
See, that's a tricky question. There's only one that I'm 100% certain I found which was Bon Jovi "Slippery When Wet," which I'm has my girlfriend's my first girlfriend's high school girlfriend's phone number on it.
Did you ring the number? Did you ring the number?
I never did ring the number, but then I found her online and it's like, could we get together and talk about this quest I'm on? And I showed it to her and she's like, that was my number in high school. I was like, oh my God, it's just a mind-blowing moment. I mean, God knows who has it now. I still have the record, and sometimes I'm like, I'm just going to call it and see who's there and talk to them about Bon Jovi. But some of the other records, I mean, you really are going on things like skips. Like there are certain records where I'm like, Exile on Main Street, I'm pretty sure on Tumbling Dice, there's a skip in that one, but is that my skip or is that somebody else's skip? So you start listening to things over and over again.
It touched a creative nerve with people reading this over in the States, because it was a #1 bestseller, was it not?
It was. It's very weird, the people who reach out and say that they feel the same way, and it started them on their own quest to find some of their records, and or it made them realize, it's time to pull those records out of storage, that they mean something. So yeah, it really it weirdly connected. It was really I don't know if you know this. It kind of started because of Questlove, the Roots drummer, who I was interviewing him for MTV, and we were talking about, he has this massive record collection of just thousands, and he was showing me some of his records, and he had this 45, the first 45 he ever bought, what was it? Rapper's Delight,
Sugar Hill Gang,
price tag, Sugar Hill Gang. Thank you. And it was as a kid, and he bought it, and it was the first one, and he held on to it, and I was like, wow, that's just amazing to me that you still have this record, that you didn't get rid of it along the way. And Questlove was like, well, Spitz, I'm sure you have one or two records that mean that much to you that you never get rid of. And I said, oh no, I sold all my records in the 90s because rent and bill money. And he looked at me with this expression like I just told him, like, and then I put the pillow over my father's face and I waited for him to die. I mean, horrified that I would do that. And that sent me into this existential crisis, like I may have made a huge mistake, and went off trying to find these records. And it's kind of, it's like hunting for a serial killer. Like there's only so many places he could be. So you kind of make a map of where, like, I sold them at this record store, and then they can be in this periphery. I mean, no one's going to buy a record and go like, all right, it's off to Japan. Like, it's got to be in the general area. So I was convinced that I could find them all, but it's so hard to say.